the voice. Okay, well, folks, welcome back to History Matters, and so does coffee. I'm so pleased to be back. I'm so pleased that folks are back. I was on a sort of vacation trip. Actually, let me move chat because I will get distracted by you guys. I was on a sort of vacation family trip in August, and so Matt, my partner in crime, and I pre-recorded some episodes so that we would have an episode every week so that we could say we had not ever missed an episode in all of the time that we've been doing this. And then last week, as probably most of you know, Newbie was out of sorts. And he just looked at me. He's like, "Me? You talking to me?" Yeah, I am. And so I had to cancel the episode because the hospital that he was at was going to call me at 10. And anyway, so last week, Matt and you guys, I suppose, had the brilliant idea of rerunning an episode we'd done before, but with live chat. So we have not missed an episode. This is the 74th. I've already forgotten it. And I said 2 minutes ago, the 74th episode, I believe, and we have not missed an episode in 74 weeks, which I'm so proud of us. But at any rate, we are back, and today we are going to be talking, the question at the core of what we're going to be talking about today is, can the press be neutral? I suppose one could also say, should the press be neutral? But before we plunge into that, I am going to turn to my partner in crime, Matt, who is going to tell us the rules of the game.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for coming back. We're so excited to be back live. Tell your neighbors, tell your friends that we are back at it. And thanks for being so patient with us while we were dealing with so many different things and a very different kind of August than in previous year, the last year, I guess it was. Rules of the game are as follows. Please make sure to use chat. We do like hearing from you and seeing from you. Just make sure that you are making your messages to everyone, and that you are, of course, trying to make your conversations germane to the conversation, and that you are, of course, family friendly. Those are our chat rules. If you do have questions, we do try to get to as many questions as we possibly can. Please make sure to put those in Q&A. In the Q&A section of Zoom, which hopefully you all know how to use by now. Make sure you put in lots of questions because I'd like to be able to help or to try to answer as many questions as possible. And as always, if you do like what we're doing here at the National Council for History Education, please join us. You can visit us at www.ncheteach.org. Yes, org. I completely blanked on the website for 2 seconds there. And you can.
So many weeks.
I know, right? And you can look at some of our content. We're going to be expanding that in the next week or so. Just want to throw this out there. We are going to be announcing our fall lineup of programming in the next week. So we have great webinars coming up. We're just finalizing, I think, one of them. We have some book talks. We have, and then we also we'll be having registrations open for our spring colloquia, live in-person spring colloquia at some really impressive places all around the country, including the Pacific Northwest. So we're looking forward to that in the spring of 2022. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Joanne, and we'll look forward to a great conversation today.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you, Matt. Okay, so as I tweeted out and Matt tweeted out, the topic for today, which was going to be the topic last week, and I stuck with it, was the question, can the press be neutral? And the reason I originally thought of it when I was supposed to be talking about it was partly because of the coverage of Afghanistan. Let me move something here so that I am perfect. Okay. So what struck me, and actually what struck Heather Cox Richardson as well in our podcast, we talked about it some, there we go, was the degree to which it seemed as though there wasn't any neutral coverage of what was going on in Afghanistan, that people were had very strong views. And mostly that's what we were seeing in the press, so that it felt as though it was particularly hard to get a read on what was really happening. Was it a disaster? Was it a yay? It takes a brave president to do this. And there was very little in between those 2 points of view. So that initially was what inspired me to this topic. Now, this week, we have another topic that is, we haven't necessarily seen that much press coverage of it yet, but for reasons that I'll mention in a moment, odds are it won't necessarily be neutral. But that word is more hedged in with importance in this case, and that is the question of abortion and its legality and what happened in Texas. Obviously, a very emotional issue for many. And so it continues the question that I raised last week, which is, can the press be neutral? In this case, I suppose, should the press be neutral, but can the press be neutral? Hang on a second here, you just vanished, Matt. There you go. Okay, now there's something for me to look at. At any rate, so with the new topic in the press, we still need to be thinking about what the press is reporting, how the press is reporting it. Sorry, guys, I'm like out of practice. And the larger question, can the press be neutral? Now, I want to, as always, go back to early America when people were really explicitly, constantly thinking about the role of the press in civic society, in the political realm, in actually the governance of the country. And certainly, from the beginning, there was never a question that the press was vital, that a free press was particularly vital to what at the time they would have considered to be initially, I guess, British rights and liberties, ultimately just their general rights and liberties. A free press was assumed to be vitally important. Europeans who came to the United States always thought that Americans were, I think, as someone called it in one letter, a particularly newspapered people, that they were very focused on newspapers. They were, not that they weren't in other countries or in England, but Americans particularly really were focused on newspapers and what they said. So when you look at early America and you see people speaking about the press and about newspapers, you can sense constantly its political importance. That said, it remains a little bit ambiguous because even though it's important and a free press is very important, no one likes to be the victim of a free press. And so for a variety of different reasons, there are moments in early American history when the press is hedged in for political reasons. Always it's done either with different justifications for it or sort of on the sly. But in one way or another, there were moments in early America where people clamped down on a free press. The most obvious one is the Alien and Sedition Acts, in this case, the Sedition Acts in 1798. And in that case, the Sedition Act, the Federalists who were in power, John Adams was president, they claimed that at a time of war, because the United States was engaged in the quasi-war, the not quite a war with France, the Federalists said, well, during a time of war, it would not do to have the press attack the government. That will weaken the government, and the government is weak already. It only rests on public opinion at this point, and if the public turns its back on the government, it might fall. So they used a kind of national security justification for the Sedition Act. Of course, the Federalists were also really happy to squash the Jeffersonian Republican press. They didn't advertise that as much, but again, this sort of mixed message of a free press. Under Jefferson, when he was president, he was not in favor of a national attack on the press. However, he did, how do I want to put this? Not necessarily promote, but discuss how it might be useful to have some state governments, state attorneys general, clamp down on Federalist newspapers that were saying negative things about him. Again, not necessarily wanting or promoting anything big scale as far as legislation goes, but also at least acknowledging that on a certain level, he understood the need to maybe silence a free and irritating press on occasion. So there's no question that the press was important and that the press was pesky. But the interesting question, and one that I didn't really, I suppose, focus on aspects of it until my most recent book, is the press and neutrality. because I think for a long time, at least, we'll come back in the end to where we are now, but I think for a long time, there has been an assumption that the press is supposed to be neutral, that the press is supposed to be presenting information. That's seen as an ideal before everyone began attacking the other, other presses that they don't like as being not neutral. We're in a moment where it's very hard to use or think about that term in the press for a variety of reasons. But I think generally many people assume, without looking into other time periods, but it's seemingly an ideal, right? That we should have a free and neutral or unbiased press, that's really what a responsible press is. But the fact of the matter is that when you look at early American newspapers and even antebellum newspapers in the beginning of the 19th century, unbiased, a lack of bias, being neutral was really not only not an issue, it wasn't assumed to be the goal in most cases. Newspapers, there were different kinds of newspapers in early America and beyond, but particularly in early America, there were commercial newspapers aimed at shipping, which generally speaking were not politically minded. And so the question of bias was not as extreme there. But then there were political newspapers. And in that case, of course, they were, particularly as partisanship rose and Federalists and Republicans began attacking each other, political newspapers were extremely biased, and of course, didn't present themselves and say, we shall now present you with the very biased Jeffersonian, Republican, or Federalist point of view, but instead they said, well, we have the truth, and they are a partisan rag, which you should totally not pay attention to. But the fact is, these newspapers were funded by politicians, right? Individual politicians contributed money to create the newspapers. They were seen as mouthpieces for particular parties or alliances. That was the role that they served. There was no question about that. In one case, the Burr's followers were angsting at a certain point about not having a press they controlled, because without a press, I think the phrase that one of Burr's followers used was, we will be but individual atoms. And there'll be no way for us to come together and have a voice without a press. So neutrality, a free and neutral press, was not the goal in that early period, and people weren't looking for that. Now, that said, people didn't necessarily come out, newspaper men, usually men, did not necessarily come out and say, hi, we're biased, we'll only present Federalist news. Part of the game of the press was to sort of suggest that you're offering news and the other folks are entirely horribly biased. So an example, I went looking this morning for this and I couldn't find the specific letters that I was thinking of to be able to quote to you, but I can offer you to this. It happens in Massachusetts in the mid to late 1790s. I remember finding it at the Massachusetts Historical Society, and it's a great example of what I'm talking about here. There were these Federalists in Massachusetts. Theodore Sedgwick is one of them. Henry Van Schack and Peter Van Schack are also two Federalists in Massachusetts at that point, and the three of them are writing to each other a lot in the mid and late 1790s. And what I remember and could not find this morning is they were trying, particularly the Van Schacks, who are in Massachusetts, and Sedgwick was in Congress. The Van Schacks wanted to get a Federalist article in a Republican newspaper. And the Republican newspaper claimed that it was like open to all news, right? That it wasn't just reporting Republican news, but it was going to be serving the community, blah, blah, blah. It had language suggesting open to all. So the Van Schacks basically figured they would try that. They would test that. They would force that issue. So they kept trying to get an article published in that newspaper, the Republican newspaper, a Federalist article. And what I remember finding at the Massachusetts Historical Society was a series of letters from these brothers or cousins, I don't even remember which they were, to Sedgwick, basically saying, yeah, I tried again today, I tried again this week, and they kept being given excuses. Well, there's no room today, we can't fit it in today. The excuses got more and more feeble. The press didn't say, this newspaper didn't say, you know what, just give it up because we're not going to put your article in here. They came up with reasons why, for one reason or another, it couldn't get in the paper. So there was a sort of glance at the suggestion that the news wasn't biased in these newspapers, but it was. And that's the case for quite a while in the first half of the 19th century. One of the interesting things when I was researching my most recent book and I was trying to track examples of physical violence in the US Congress, the newspapers that I was looking at, or the newspapers that I spent the most time looking at, were newspapers that in one way or another served as a kind of congressional record. So they have a semi-official function, and yet there were newspapers on either side. And if I read incidents described in one and in another, or even just run-of-the-mill speeches in one or in the other, I sometimes couldn't really tell what was said or what happened. It couldn't, in that case, it had to be very subtle, because those are supposed to be not really government documents, but they're supposed to be credible as records of what's going on in Congress. That said, even they were, they would silence people they didn't like and just not report them on one side, and then they would do the same thing on the other side to get back at them. They would exaggerate things, and there were levels. I think what I wrote down here on my piece of paper is a hierarchy of bias often in newspapers. So there were different ways in which you could read a story in a newspaper, and the assumption was that there were different levels of, I don't want to say bias, but some were seemingly more personal than other forms of news in the newspapers. And so the assumption, I think, could have been, and I'll explain what I mean in a moment here, that when you're looking at one, it's seemingly less biased than another. It's not necessarily so, but again, there was a sort of subterranean language of I guess it was the Daily Show truthiness that they came up with, the word truthiness. There was a kind of subterranean message of truthiness flowing through the different kinds of articles in newspapers in the first half of the 19th century. So for example, you would find at that point Congress was of much more interest to people than the president was. So the newspapers were full of congressional news, and typically newspapers would have a lengthy column that seemingly was just offering a condensed version of what was being said in Congress, like speeches, and dialogue, and very long, accounts of what was being said. And given how much space was given to that, you have to assume that people were actually reading these lengthy accounts of congressional debates. Now, you look at that and you would assume that's relatively unbiased. Compared to some other things in the newspaper, probably it was, but as I suggested a moment ago, certain things would or wouldn't be reported, certain people would or wouldn't be included. There were subtle ways in which you could angle what you were reporting to be more or less in favor of what you wanted it to be. The fellow at the center of my last book, the congressional clerk, Benjamin Brown French, he actually liked the opposing party's newspaper because he liked the way that they used language better, even though he acknowledged that they weren't really quite on target with, I suppose, what he might have called truthiness. But in addition to these seemingly unbiased accounts of congressional debate, there were things in newspapers called letters, which did indeed, they took the format of a personal letter, and often they were, dear Mr. Editor or some version of that. In the early years, these letter writers were just random, a gentleman from Boston writes this letter and tells me, and then they would include some kind of news in them. They were personal letters, they were framed as personal letters. And so the assumption there is it's not necessarily totally objective news, because it's, a gentleman who knows such things, who just came across from England on a boat and so was just there, says. So they were framed as personal messages. That's obviously in that subterranean language of bias or lack of bias, much more biased. Over time, in the 19th century, particularly in political newspapers, you get letter writers who just consistently are kind of like columnists. And this is particularly true. They plant themselves in Washington, D.C., and they send letters back to their editors, very much reading like letters. I went here, I heard this, you can't believe what they sounded like, but very personal in a way. But again, framed as though they are offering you on the ground, in person accounts of what's happening. And very often the the byline, right? They weren't signed with an actual name, right? There was a pseudonym of some kind, and the pseudonym would be something like "Your Man on the Ground" or "Eyes Aware," or I can't remember what the name of Benjamin Brown. Benjamin Brown French had 2 or 3 names that he gave, and they were an onlooker, and someone watching, whatever. They all had names like that were like, I'm here and I can see things, but you don't know who I am. So you can assume, given that you don't know who I am, that maybe I'm a little bit objective and really just giving you the news, which is a long way of saying that really, although newspapers and the press and other kinds of vehicles of news wanted people to believe what they were publishing on the one hand, so they couldn't be screamingly sort of crazy as far as their bias goes. On the other hand, they weren't objective, and they weren't really trying to be objective. And what's interesting when you look at the press in this sort of chunk of decades that I'm talking about, you see the evolution of ideas about objectivity and should it be there. That's a much later phenomenon. It's not, certainly in the period that I write about, a neutral press, is sort of not a goal. But you can see them sort of evolving ways of understanding how to get news that are not necessarily unbiased, but are not necessarily, I am a guy, and it usually was a guy sitting around giving you my point of view. So for example, there's some point, and I want to say it's like in the 1850s, it was very late in the period I was researching, when you see newsmen in Washington come up with the idea of interviewing members of Congress, right? Not copying what they're saying, not commenting on what they're saying, but actually interviewing them. And I did not have time to dig and find, and at this, I don't even remember initially where I saw it. I just remember noting it. I don't think I even wrote about it, but it was fascinating to me that you saw these newspapermen sort of, this is really interesting. Like, you can interview these people and they can say things, and then you can blame whatever's being printed on them. And what an interesting idea. It's not the sort of thing that you would think needs to be invented, but in the evolution of the press, it's something that sort of people eventually realized the usefulness of and began to incorporate it. All of this is a long way of saying that can the press be neutral? Well, in early America and antebellum America, although there was a posture of offering the truth, neutral was not really the goal and was not really generally achieved. And for that reason, people are reading all kinds of newspapers. Americans are newspapered, but they're constantly writing to their friends in government and saying, okay, now tell us what the real truth is, because I don't know what to believe in the newspaper. That supposedly now is a modern value with a press. It's supposed to be offering you the news and not necessarily constantly opinion. And there's a long conversation we can have about what that means and how that translates into the modern world. That said, I think in recent years, and maybe I'm not going to even put a number on it. In recent years, we've been seeing a number of things happen in the press that neutrality and the role of the press and what presses are actually producing is under debate in some ways, right? Fake news is the sort of cliched way of referring to a larger problem, which is, how do you know what to believe when there really is not an assumption that what you're reading is sort of blunt, unbiased, I shall present you with the news. There's that posture being presented. That was actually my phone. I feel like one of my students. Hang on, there. There's the posture of like, well, we're presenting the news and we are the news, and those other people are a horrible bunch of, they're producing partisan rags, they're fake news. That phrase and the sort of frequency with which it's used points to a problem that we're in the middle of, which is, what is the truth and how can you tell what the truth is? In the case of the reporting on Afghanistan, it was, the podcast that I do, Heather Cox Richardson and I were trying to figure out what to say about Afghanistan, and which was when we began talking to each other about the fact that it was very hard to get past this is a travesty and a disaster, or it takes a brave president to end a war, and that it was very hard to find anything in between. I think that's still the case. We're just now starting to grapple in the news with the implications of what just happened in Texas with their law essentially overruling Roe v. Wade. But what's interesting about that is, I cannot predict this, but based on everything I'm saying here, I would assume there's going to be a lot of reporting about that that may or may not have a lot to do with something that is credibly implied or implicated with that law. So once again, we, the reading public, are going to be put in the position of trying to figure out the truth rather than assuming that we are being presented with neutral truth. Now that's, that on the one hand, okay, we have always been consumers of the news in one way or another. That's what readers are. On the other hand, I don't think we, speaking broadly, have fully wrapped our minds around the fact that you really can't take for granted what you read in any way, and really need to think and rethink and research. And before I on social media, before I retweet things, I will check different reporters and go into different venues and really try and figure out before I tweet something, do I really think this is true? That's fascinating as someone who studies either history or the history of journalism. But on the other hand, that's a lot of effort to figure out what is actually happening. And that's not a lot of effort. That amount of effort is not something that a lot of people are willing to do. So I guess, whether it's for deliberately warping the news, whether it's to be dramatic and sell newspapers, whether it's just out of sheer laziness and things are being printed because they read well in a headline. I don't mean to attack the press, because I obviously defend, not violently, but earnestly and passionately, a free press. But the combination of where the press is and the fact that technology spreads, whatever the press is doing, with incredible speed, and is thus complicating the moment that we're in, it means that we really need to think about what we're reading, and not necessarily whether it's fake news or not, but more careful than that and more subtle than that. How is what we're reading, how might it be biased? And what cautions should we take in evaluating what we're reading? It's a lot more work on our part. And those of you who are following me here, who, like me in one way or another, are teachers, we need to think about how to sort of open the eyes of our students to the fact that when they read something online, it isn't necessarily true, but then how do they evaluate it? At this moment in time, when, as I've talked about so many times before, it's a moment that's unstable. It's a moment that can see and may see even more potentially dramatic change. At that kind of moment, it's ever more important to be updated on what's happening. And ironically and sadly, it's very difficult for us to pierce the sort of white noise, the hum of people doing all kinds of strange partisan things to get across what they want and not really report on what's happening. There was never a golden period of press neutrality, so I don't want to be doing what I think very often people do generally, right? Remember back in the blah blah days when everything was wonderful. There was never a golden period, but we're in a moment now where the goal of being neutral is in a different place than it might have been, is less, I don't want to say less adhered to, but questioned in some ways, is making us rethink how we read the news. And that's important to think about, increasingly important to think about, and will not stop being important to think about for some time to come. So particularly as we see issues like the question of abortion and whatever comes next week or the week after that, it behooves us to really put that extra effort in to trying to figure out what is actually happening on the ground, and then to take the next step up and figure out what different sides, how they're interpreting what's happening on the ground. But don't take neutrality for granted, I suppose is the message of what I'm saying today. And be wary news consumers. It's not a new idea, but the fact that neutrality has come in and out of style, so to speak, really highlights the fact that there is no one way to present the news, and that we always have to think about the ways in which it's being presented. Okay, I'm going to now stop talking so that we can have a discussion. We can answer questions. I'm going to open chat up again. And Matt, you are going to reappear. Wow, all this conversation going on. So, but right. So I see people mentioning particular publications, right? That there are certain publications that, someone mentioned Muck. Matt is gone. Where are you, Matt? With the questions. But indeed, there are certain newspapers, like someone says the New York Times. There is no publication at this point that I can read, and even the New York Times and the Washington Post, both of which I read. In any case, I stop and think about who's writing it and what they're writing and why they're writing it and how it plugs into the debate. And it's a lot of work, as I suggested before, with what we should or shouldn't be doing. Matt has vanished. I'm not seeing Matt. Are you guys seeing Matt? Matt. Okay, no Matt. Okay. I'm going to answer a question with no Matt. Susan, as a historian, do I believe a neutral press is even possible? As a psychologist, Susan thinks unbiased news or unbiased journalism isn't possible at all. Everyone has implicit biases. What do I think about this? Well, I think that's a really good question. And I guess I would say psychologically speaking, I agree that everyone has biases. As a historian, I think about that too all the time, right? I think historians have to think about that fact that when I'm evaluating things or when I'm reading the work of another historian, that I'm going to have the biases that I plug in. And if I'm not aware of them, I might say something that ultimately, when I go back and look at it, is going to feel less accurate, which will really peeve me, I will say. So you're right that everyone has some kind of implicit bias, but I think I used the word hierarchy before. I think you can be more or less neutral, right? So I think if you write something, for example, right, we saw a very frequent phenomenon, and this was actually also in the New York Times in the last couple of years, of speaking to people who supported former President Trump. Why did you vote for him, or why did you not? And so there was a lot in the news about what were Trump voters thinking. Okay, but there were a lot of people griping about the fact that, oh, there's Matt, you're back. That why weren't people asking other kinds of voters what they thought, and why were we constantly seeing those people justifying what they did? There's a case in which, is it biased? We could argue about that, but certainly people were arguing that only one thing was being shown and nothing else was being shown. I think there's degrees. I mean, I think we all know, let me put it this way. I think we all know when we read an article, if there's lots of evidence, if there are citations and quotes and specific references to things that actually are checkable, that we assume on a certain level that there might be more truthiness in that sort of thing versus something that feels full of accusation. But I agree with the underlying assumption under that question, which is absolute neutrality probably isn't possible. What we're talking about, I guess, is goal versus outcome, right? You can aim to write something that is presenting news in a way that you think has less bias to it, or you can be really just promoting your own point of view. And we're not talking clear lines in the sand. We're talking about shadings here. But I think we all have a sort of gut instinct, right? That you can tell when you're reading something absolute, unvarnished, just bias versus something shadier. It's the shadier territory that becomes trickier for us to parse, but also really important in these moments when so much is at stake.
Thanks
the mug reveal.
Yeah, I was gonna say, thank you. It's my fault. So totally my fault. So I had to step away for like 4 minutes, and it was the worst 4 minutes possible. So
okay, the mug reveal. My apologies. As those of you who saw any of the episodes we pre-recorded when I was out of town, the first one we did, I forgot to reveal the mug, and then we came back and I said Carolee was not there to remind me, and so I totally blamed it on you, Carolee. But I have a mug which raises questions about objectivity, but it's my C-SPAN book TV mug, right? So C-SPAN is interesting in the realm of news because they're just sometimes presenting like what's happening in Congress, and you can watch what's going on, which in a way is unvarnished news, you could say. That said, unvarnished news with people standing up and promoting their case. Personally, when there's something going on in Congress, I will flip back and forth between C-SPAN to see what's going on, and then some cable channel to see how people are commenting on it. That raises interesting questions too. But at any rate, this is my interesting questions of news mug for today. So thank you guys for reminding me. Okay, and now I don't know if there must be some folks here that maybe have not been here before. I will say every week there's a thematic mug linked to what we're talking about, and Matt chooses a background that has something to do with what we're talking about. And I don't know if anyone has tried.
I have seen no guesses whatsoever. I'm very disappointed. Although there's a great conversation about C-SPAN in the chat right now. But yeah, the background. The background is the E. Clem Wilson building.
Which is?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
You see it a little bit better. So the E. Clem Wilson building. So this is going deep in my Nerdtastic life. This is the
all have a Nerdtastic life.
I know. This is really digging deep. The E. Clem Wilson building is an Art Deco building. Thank you. Somebody got it. This was the
Gina daily 4,283rd guess.
This is the building for the Daily Planet in Superman, the original series, and they only had it for the first season. So 1952, this was the Daily Planet for the Adventures of Superman.
Wow. Okay, so, I would not have guessed that, but that's pretty nerdtastic.
Thank you. This is this picture. I think it's from I got it from the Smithsonian, who got it from the LA Library. But this is the picture's from 1935, and the reason I went with this one is because apparently now it has like a giant billboard over at the top, it goes all the way around, and it just, I don't know, it's just tacky. So I went with the historic.
No, the classic
Yes.
view. Yes. I love the fact that Liz said, "Truly a mystery why no one correctly guessed." This is kind of the opposite of it's the Cheers bar, right?
Yeah, right. The Cheers bar was a little bit easier. I went hard, but I went deep today. So.
Logical. I actually thought for a moment that it was going to have something to do with Mary Tyler Moore or Lou Grant, which could have been.
That would have been a good one. That would have been a really good one. I was trying to think of different ones, and yeah, I went superhero. I
think it's good. I think superhero is a reminder of the need we have for the press. So I applaud your choice, Matt.
Thank you. Okay, so we do have lots of questions here. Thank you for having lots of questions. It makes my life a lot easier. Melissa started off with a great question. Did Eliza Hamilton and Julia Rush ever discuss what to do with their impulsive, verbose husbands who were enemies in the press?
Not that I am aware of having seen. Wow, that's a really interesting question.
Yes. It's an incredibly specific question too, but I thought it was, but it's
a really, but I'll broaden it to be more broad in a moment. But no, I do not think that's the case. I actually don't know if or how those two women had a relationship with each other. I don't know. I know that Benjamin Rush was very Republican, and he was really not a fan of Hamilton, so they were not engaging. The only time I can think of friendly conversation happening between Benjamin Rush and Hamilton is when Philip Hamilton dies, and Philip Hamilton was friends with Benjamin Rush's son, and there's actually a very nice correspondence between them. But other than that, they're not writing friendly letters to each other. But that's not necessarily the case with wives, with women. So that is an interesting question, which is how and if women weighed in on what their highly politicized husbands were saying. You have to think that they did at times, but that they would not necessarily have done that in writing. There's Catherine Allgore has her book Parlor Politics, and one of the things that she writes in that book about women and politics, and mostly the first half or the first couple decades of the 19th century, is that women had this pose that they took. Well, I don't know politics. I know nothing about politics. I'm not involved in politics. And meanwhile, on a personal level, behind the scenes in Washington, of course, they were, talking to people, intervening, connecting people personally. They were very engaged. And I would assume that the same would probably be true as far as this goes as well, which is that you're not necessarily going to find on paper. You might, but you're not going to as easily find on paper, I spoke to my husband and told him, how dare you put that in the press? But you might very well have a conversation, and you might have someone say in a letter, I was a wife. I was very surprised at the blah, blah in the newspaper. And I'm sure you were too, or some kind of an expression that makes it clear that they agree on something being incorrect or wrong or shocking in the newspaper. So I think that falls into the category of things that might be less likely to be on paper, but probably in some way or another happened.
Dale's question is Clementina Rind. I may have mispronounced that completely. Rind's Virginia Gazette masthead was open to all parties but influenced by none. But she was the first to print Thomas Jefferson's A Summary View of the Rights of British America in 1774. Were there other newspapers at the time with such iconic variance between their stated point of view and what they actually published?
Well, that's a great question because, yes, in the sense that very often what you would see, I suppose because the newspapers were so clearly taking one side or another, is, you would see one of two things. Sometimes you would see newspapers that very clearly were, on opposite sides, Federalist and Republican, but they would be talking to each other. So the assumption is that people are reading or are aware of what's happening in both newspapers, which means it really is more of a conversation, which in a sense is not a silo, right? That's it. So nowadays we often talk about people being siloed with the news, but if the newspapers are assuming people are reading both sides, that's an interesting sort of, people who are reading the New York Times aren't necessarily watching Fox News and vice versa. But this practice in early America, it sort of moves along those lines. The other thing that happened also in early America is that newspapers sometimes would publish both sides or an enemy essay in full and then follow it with snark, right? But they would publish what was written and then attack it. But so the short answer, I've just given you a long answer. The short answer is newspapers, particularly in early America, did engage with each other and talk to each other, and thus have actual conversations in ways that in some ways happen less often nowadays. More snark, less repetition of what other people are saying.
So Miranda, I want to read this question out loud because the way I'm reading it is, I'm not sure if this is how she intended it, but this, I love the way it's phrased.
I'm nervous now, but go right ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Who was best at handling the media as far as presidents, and why is it Abraham Lincoln and all?
Okay.
So I don't know if she meant it that way, but that's
right.
Like, who is the best president with handling the media, and why was it Abraham Lincoln? That's the way I'm reading this, which I love.
Which is wonderful. I can't make a pronouncement about all presidents across all time. I can say that there are a lot of presidents that were not particularly good at it. George Washington did not like bad press about himself at all. He threw a major temper tantrum. In one case, when someone published a cartoon that was negative about him, he wasn't good with bad press. And he didn't try to maneuver that situation. He just yelled. I don't think that under John Adams, there was the Sedition Act. So even though he didn't initiate that, that doesn't speak well. I don't think Jefferson and Madison and Monroe were particularly good or bad. I think Andrew Jackson had a very friendly and subservient press. And by that point, the Jacksonian Democrats are really organized. So is he the best with the press? No, but because his party is really organized by that point, they're sure using the press, their version of it, really effectively. Lincoln, you could say any number of things about Lincoln, but one of the things you could say is he used language and he used his personality and who he was and his manner and where he came from in a really effective way to communicate. So, for example, there's a book called I'm going to get it wrong. It's by Kenneth Camille, Cmiel, and it's something like the democratization of language or something. What it's about is the shift in language from what you expect in early America with lots of Latin references to, just as the title suggests, a much more democratic, small d, way of communicating. And there's a chapter, if I remember correctly, on Lincoln and the way he used English and the way in which he deliberately spoke to a broad audience without sounding at all patronizing, right? So he was, I think, a skilled communicator, and that probably is part of the answer to that question, I would say. Someone will find the name of that book. I know. Kenneth Camille, Cmiel, and it's the democratization of something. It has a chapter on, I think, Thomas Paine, a chapter on Abraham Lincoln. Anyway, I will allow you guys to go with that, and let's go on to the next question.
Well, actually, the next question is mine, because what we're going to do here is just kind of start leaping through forward to time, because most of the other questions kind of deal with today and all that kind of stuff. But I wanted to ask this question as a bridge to that, which is, what do you think is the biggest difference in the quote unquote neutrality of the press between your scholarship and what you understand of the founding period and your scholarship and how you understand the pre-Civil War in Field of Blood time period?
I would say the biggest difference is a result of technology. Mm-hmm. And that is when you get steam-powered printing presses, when you get cheaper paper produced in mass quantities, when you get the railroad, when you get the telegraph. There are all kinds of ways in which news is spreading nationally more broadly than ever before and more quickly than ever before. And I know at some point I've said this, who the heck knows what episode, that politics essentially is a big conversation between people with power and people who assign that power, give that power, and any democratic eloquence. Thank you, Jean. That is the book I was referring to. Anytime a technology shapes that conversation, it shapes democracy in one way or another. So all of those forms of technology that I just mentioned, they shape the way Americans connect with each other and the way that they learn news, and thus, in a sense, they shape everything. So I would say the impact of technology in the reach and speed of news is the biggest difference. And I know I've talked about it before, but watching people in government grapple with the fact that, for example, in Congress, you can say something really inflammatory and there's no wiggle room. You say it, and then in 45 minutes, the whole nation is going to know about it. That changes the way that politics works, but it's not an immediate change, right? So it's an evolving process, but I think that technology causes, there are many reasons, many things that are different, but technology is one of the major causes of some of those differences.
So this is a nice bridge into Dave's question, which is, how was the quote unquote free press defined, thought of at the founding versus, say, the press that covered the Vietnam War with the 3 major national broadcasts and lots of very good newspapers versus today with the the rise of social media and the dearth of newspapers?
Repeat that question for me again. I didn't quite.
Sure thing. So this concept of free press, how was that? You talked a lot about how that was thought of and defined, and neutrality at the founding area. How would you say that as different or evolved from that time period versus like the coverage of the Vietnam War or what we see covered on news organizations today?
Well, I mean, this is probably broader than the question intends to be, but despite the fact that we're constantly having arguments about news and fake news and what is news and how is news spreading, I do think, generally speaking, Americans still understand the value and importance of a free press, right? They may not be acting according to that belief all the time, but I think people understand why that's important. The Bill of Rights is interpreted in so many interesting ways. But I do think people understand that in a democracy, a free press is important. And even in the early period, Jefferson hated sometimes what the press said about him, and he tried to find ways to sort of shut up some of the people saying things that irritated him. But also, he totally recognized you need a free press and that that's just what's going to happen. So I think that general idea hasn't changed. What you do with that freedom maybe has changed over time, but I don't know. Vietnam, I have memories of news coverage of Vietnam, but I was a kid, so my memory of news coverage of Vietnam is lots of TV news coverage of people wearing combat helmets surrounded by forest or jungle talking, and I didn't necessarily know what was going on. But I knew that it was real because I could see that it was in Vietnam, which I know is not answering the question, but anytime someone says Vietnam, I think about being totally perplexed watching TV. I do think, I do think people like Walter Cronkite, right, had a believability to him that is harder to get today, I think, for any individual journalist, right? There was a way in which he had a sincerity to him that was less colored by people's assumptions about news or what the news was. And that would have affected how people understood things in that era, including things like Vietnam. I don't know if that answers the question, but that's
no, I think that really gets to the heart of what the question's about. I want to revisit not revisit, but Tim gets a special 2-question today, which is so the last couple minutes of maybe we talk a little bit about what's going on today in a historical context, which really is there seems to be a big distrust of quote unquote mainstream media these days. How would you differentiate mainstream media from independent media now and historically? Is my addition to that question. And then are there any red flags where you in articles where you're like the red flag is for bias?
Well, I think mainstream media versus independent media is not always a useful dividing line. I think mainstream media has become kind of an attack phrase used and made popular by people who feel that the mainstream media, meaning there's a majority of people who don't seem to like them and thus they must be bad and biased, is the underlying message of I hate mainstream media. In a sense, mainstream media is short for large and highly subsidized in some way commercial presses versus like independent, ace reporters sort of on the ground on a smaller level or on a local level. But I don't think you can say across the board that smaller or more local is less biased, right? I don't think any of us would make that claim either. So, I think the phrase mainstream media has come to have a lot of baggage attached to it as far as what it means that wasn't necessarily always there as far as baggage is concerned, and it is worth thinking about. That said, I think it is true that it's not so bad to be aware of the ways in which finance and money and headlines and selling newspapers for major enterprises of profit might shape what is communicated as news. That's realistic too.
And that's not that different than the founding era, right.
In the end, there's profit, right? In the end, you're worried about profit in one way or another. Now, the early American newspapers generally were not very profitable for people. And there's a reason why they came and went, and they would last a year and, have 1,000 subscribers, a newspaper, and then vanish and then reappear again. When you're researching in early American newspapers, it's often so difficult because there'll be a newspaper that's like the Daily Herald, and then that will go out of business, and someone else will take it over and it will be the New Daily Herald, and then it will become the Weekly Herald, and then it will become the Herald and Reporter, and that's all the same newspaper, but there are slight tweaks in the title of it. So doing that kind of research using guides and indexes and things, it's really hard because they change, for one reason or another, poof, and suddenly you have to decide if it's the same or not the same. But in a sense, you could say that's not mainstream media, that's independent media that comes and goes, and it depends on who happens at the moment to be running it. There are pros and cons to that too.
Well, one final question, as we're just about out of time.
Oh, look at that, man.
I know.
Yes.
See, things go much faster when I leave for 4 minutes.
I got a little nervous there, Matt. I was like,
I texted you. I'm like, I really have to check on this. I'll be right with you.
My phone. I didn't
know if your phone was right next to you.
No, it was not in front of me. Oh, here. Going until 10:35. Yeah, no, I didn't see that.
Last question from Emily. This is a great way to end our conversation today because it's really relevant. Which is, do you think there was ever a time when Americans were well-educated consumers of the news? In other words, was there a time when we were better at discerning bias?
Interesting. So I'm going to have a sort of equivocal response to that. My gut response is we might have been better at discerning bias only because we wouldn't necessarily, well, this is better and worse. We wouldn't necessarily have assumed there was always bias, which means people might have picked up more quickly on things that seemed like extreme bias. That said, that means that there's all kinds of stuff going on beneath the surface that people didn't catch. So Dave said, spoiler alert, no, there's never a time. I think in a way, the story of a free press is the evolution of presenting things as truth and the public deciding what is and isn't truthful, and then presses coming up with new ways to present things that are going to grab audiences in different ways. And in a sense, in that way too, there's a conversation between newspapers and consumers that's ongoing, which would be a very long way of saying I kind of agree with Dave in the end, probably, that maybe what changes over time is the language of that conversation between newspapers and consumers, but that they're constantly, again, because profit is part of what's going on here, there's constant reconnoitering and game playing to some degree about what will get people's attention. How far can you go to get people's attention without really being totally irresponsible in what you're reporting? I think that's eternal. Or not eternal, but certainly a long-standing problem. The problem is that the times that we're living in are so unstable, and there's so much at stake in so many big ways that some of these questions that are interesting to discuss become really immediate and really pressing, and can have immediate consequences, partly because of the speed with which they can be communicated, social media, that suddenly things that were interesting, not necessarily just intellectual questions, but broader questions about the press, they're not broader questions about the press. They're questions that are like, what do I need to be thinking about right now, and how important is this? So there's as with so much else about our current moment, there's an immediacy and an urgency to our thinking about the press now that is not always the case.
And I just might add, I mean, even with those conditions being true, being in a free society allows us the ability to critique, criticize, and choose to not consume some media over others. Whereas in societies that are not free,
right,
that is not necessarily the case.
Right. There's still assumption about what people are seeing or not seeing, but you're right. That's a totally different set of circumstances. I also see here people mentioning PBS and NPR and BBC, which in some ways might be less biased, but they're not necessarily unbiased. I mean, I will certainly say I used to every morning listen to NPR, and sometimes it feels unbiased, and sometimes in one way or another, I would sort of stop and wonder what I was listening to, or want more questions to be asked of people who are being interviewed. That's another way. We haven't even talked about that, and I won't go into it now, but the idea that if you're interviewing someone or talking to someone, you need to actually respond to what they're saying in a way that informs the audience, in addition to just having that interview. And I think we see people all the time like, hey, like they asked the right question on that TV interview, or why didn't they ask the right question? That matters a lot too, which is people on the spot essentially doing what I said we all need to be doing, which is, what's your proof for that? Where does that come from? So that the person needs to offer that and the audience can see whether it exists. that kind of proof. Okay, now.
Well, with that, we are over. So I will say goodbye and let you say your
my
goodbyes.
thing of what's coming next. Okay, folks. So many of you know this, but for those who don't, I will announce it here. What happens now is we shift from our normal episode to the after party. And what that means is we are no longer recording what's going on. Instead, it's a freer conversation. It's more free flowing. It can talk about any number of things. It's a party and it's after. It's the after party. If you are tuning in here online, not through Facebook, you just stay right here and poof, we will become the after party. If you are on Facebook, you need to leave Facebook and join via the NCHE website. So that would be ncheteach.org/conversations, and just click on that and that will bring you into the after party. For those of you who are not going to head into the after party, let me say, as always, and I haven't said this for several weeks, and I'm so happy to be able to say it again, thank you all for coming to be part of this conversation. It is this kind of conversation is what democracy is all about: questioning things, probing things, trying to figure things out as a group, asking questions. Thank you for being part of that and for making that happen. I will see you next week. I don't know yet, as always, what I will talk about. This week I was irritated because I knew the topic and I still didn't remember to tell Matt until yesterday. I was like, oh, come on. Like, I even had this one in advance. But at any rate, there'll be another topic next week, which will have some topicality, will have something to do with what's going on. And I hope you'll join me. Bring your friends, bring your family, and have a good and a safe week. And now, after party time. Saving what